Okay, hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to RMCAD. My husband just said to me, are you going to walk up there with that green band on? And I said, well, everyone will know I'm 21, so it'll be okay. So welcome to RMCAD. We are so happy that you're here. I want to tell you a little bit about the college and in just 2 brief minutes. But the college was founded in 1963. So we've been here for quite a while. We're fully accredited. This is a private 4-year art and design college. And so if you're involved in the art community, I'm sure you know some of our faculty and are familiar with some of them. So we are really, really pleased to have Lucy Lippard here. We are honored to have her here. And I'd like to welcome you tonight, and I hope you enjoy the lecture, and I hope you enjoy our campus and the show that we have. And so right now I'm going to turn it over to Anna and have her give you a proper introduction of Lucy Lippard.
Okay, I'll just get this set up here. Thank you all very much for coming tonight, and welcome again to RMCAD. My name is Anna Mascorella, and I'm the coordinator for the Visiting Artist, Scholar, and Designer program, which sponsors these events. So I'm very proud to bring you the 4th installment of RMCAD's public lecture series, which is part of the VASD program. The VASD program is an interdisciplinary initiative that fosters vision, creativity, and innovation by bringing leading national and international artists, scholars, and designers to campus. Providing direct access to contemporary art, design, and culture through an inspiring comparative framework, the program creates a cross-disciplinary environment made possible through appreciation and critical inquiry. Please join us on Thursday, February 3rd from 5 to 8 p.m. for the opening of the exhibition Like You by Justin Cooper and the Philip J. Steele Gallery, and at 7 p.m. here that same evening in the Mary Harris Auditorium for a lecture and live performance by the artist. And now, as the program coordinator, I am honored to introduce this evening's distinguished guest, Lucy R. Lippard. Lucy Lippard is an internationally renowned writer, curator, activist, and author of 21 books on contemporary art and cultural criticism. For over 40 years, Ms. Lippard's visionary and often radical curatorial and critical work has made a resounding impact on our understanding of contemporary art, politics, feminism, and culture. The recipient of numerous awards, including 2 National Endowment for the Arts grants in criticism, her most recent written work includes Down Country, The Tano of the Galisteo Basin, The Lure of the Local, and On the Beaten Track, Tourism, Art, and Place. In addition to engaging in countless creative works, including performances and street theater, Ms. Lippard has curated over 50 exhibitions throughout the United States, Latin America, and Europe. Her most recent curatorial venture was 2007's Weather Report, Art and Climate Change, at the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art. Ms. Lippard has received 7 honorary degrees in fine arts and currently lives off the grid in rural Galisteo, New Mexico, where she is involved in local county politics and for over 14 years has edited the monthly community newsletter El Puente de Galisteo. On Thursday, she will be speaking at CU Boulder at 7:30 p.m. Her talk, People and Place, Why Ecology Matters, will be held in the University of Colorado Visual Arts Complex. This evening, Ms. Lippard's lecture, Imagine Being Here Now, or more specifically, Ghosts, the Daily News, and Prophecy, will deal critically with photography, landscape, place, and history. It is an honor to have Lucy Lippard here tonight. Thank you again for coming, and please join me in welcoming Lucy R. Lippard.
I can find my way out here. Thank you. Can you see that with all these lights on? Is the picture look okay? Okay. So this, as you may have figured out already, is Robert Adams. It's the path of development in Denver, agricultural land being swallowed up some time ago. It's probably well swallowed and digested by now. I wish I'd titled this, as Anna said, Ghosts, the Daily News, and Prophecy, thanks to Robert Adams. whose serial approach to landscape photography gave it a new social life. In 1980, he wrote, "What a landscape photographer traditionally tries to do is show what is past, present, and future at once. You want ghosts and the daily news and prophecy." Whoops, did I do something wrong here? Nope. Oops. It's up and down? How did I get there? How do I get backwards? There it is. Okay, sorry. Let's figure this. They just go boom, 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 and that I can cope with. So I should be just up is all right. So much has been written on the nature and agency of photography or representation or visual culture that it's hard to come up with anything new under the sun. Yet photography continues to fascinate me and many of you. So I decided to stay grounded and just sit with my present moment to see what came into view. Well, that doesn't work. So it's the sideways one that goes? Down instead? Oh, okay, I see. Got it. This is by, what am I doing here? Okay, I'll just try to stay away from it. This is by Gary Chaldella. It's a house and oil storage in the Calumet region of Illinois and Indiana where he was raised. I often offer up the title "Imagine Being Here Now" when I have no idea what I'm going to talk about yet, because I enjoy the paradox. My personal focus on photography is because of the way it can illuminate places. Why would we have to imagine a place if we're right here now? Because we're always doing it. Because every day we imagine and then live a version of our histories, our newer stories, which we then disseminate through friends and family, photography being a major vehicle for this journey. That's by Wanda Hammerbeck, who kind of sends us messages from the landscape. This is living beyond the resources, living beyond limits. The golf course in the desert. I'm not going to discuss in detail the photographs I'm showing, which kind of parallel my narrative. You can think of them in the context of social information that might influence political decisions. Despite Adams's doubts, I've found that a concentration on place, which can't really be easily conflated with land or site or landscape, brings everything into focus, including politics. Ultimately, words and images offer ways to integrate one's own imaginings of life into those of a polity. The relationship of imagination to reality and action is crucial, especially for artists and writers who specialize in acting in the gap between the two, or between art and life, what's sometimes called public practice. If we lean too far on the imagination side, we risk falling off the edge into wishful thinking, like visualize world peace. Then we fall back onto the couch. Lean too far on the reality side, and we risk getting stuck in the status quo. The late Joe Deal, in his last book, West and West, talked about his intention to reimagine what lies beneath the surveyor's grid in the open and relatively featureless spaces of the Missouri Plateau in North Dakota. If the square employed in surveys of public lands, he said, could function like a telescope, framing smaller and smaller sections of the plains down to a transect, it can also be used as a window, equilaterally divided by the horizon, that begins with a finite section of the earth and sky and restores them in the imagination to the vastness that now exists only as an idea. The landscape that is contained within the perfect symmetry of the square implies infinity. That's the end of the quote. So like photographers, Deal can make what first, like many photographers, Deal can make what first looks like nothing look like something we should have noticed. My heightened interest in photography admittedly arrived kind of late in my writing life. I was guided by my involvement in the 1960s with conceptual art and its casual approach to the medium. This is a piece by Doug Hubler, the late Doug Hubler too, unfortunately, who made this piece in Central Park. He just got out there with a camera and shot every time he heard a bird sing. And it's about 6 or 7 pictures. And I had this in my loft for years. And I could always hear the birds sing when I looked at it. As has often been said, photography is a presence based on absence. Carl Andre, whose horizontal focus helped redefine the sculptural axis in the 1960s, said, "A thing is a whole in a thing it is not." In his classic 1967 photo essay, A Tour of the Monuments of Passaic, New Jersey, Robert Smithson talked about how full of holes prosaic Passaic seemed, in contrast to solid New York. Deal's quote on landscape implying infinity, incidentally, is totally contrary to Smithson's insistence on finity, which has had more traction in current theory over the last few decades. Infinity, like utopia, is considered insufficiently down to earth. Interestingly, Smithson's writings have probably had more influence on photography than on the sculpture and land art, which were his own preoccupations. In fact, his approach to photography was so casual that in 1969 he told me to just take all the pictures in his Seattle Horizons piece for an exhibition I curated in Seattle, because he couldn't get there to do it himself because there wasn't money to get him there. Simultaneously involved in places and self-consciously removed from them, Smithson promoted a sense of suburban unreality, writing with typical ambivalence that even on sight, he felt he was photographing a photograph. This is by Aviva Romani. Are these looking very light, or is that just where I am? They're looking pale? Okay. Since the 1960s, place has become a sort of self-conscious rather than an organic concept. But of course, each place is thousands of places, each of which can be captured by a photographer. A real sense of place is a virtual immersion that's also temporal and embraces daily change. It depends both on lived experience and memory and on topographical, even infrastructural intimacy, not to mention acquired knowledge on the ground and in the books. This is the other part of the Romani. J.B. Jackson, the extraordinary essayist and cultural geographer, wrote that no landscape, vernacular or otherwise, can be comprehended unless we perceive it as an organization of space, unless we ask ourselves who owns and who uses those spaces, how they were created and how they change. This is by Chris Dikiakos. It's from his False Creek Olympics series. These are squatters' huts next to the Vancouver Olympic site, part of his many years of documenting the place names and narratives of Vancouver's places. While specificity and local knowledge provide the base in the process of following the vortex of land and lives, a tantalizing liminal space has opened up between disciplines, between the arts and photography, geography, history, archaeology, sociology, some of the sciences. Space occupied, for instance, by Trevor Paglin, who follows the black sites of governmental secrecy, and Matthew Coolidge with the Center for Land Use Interpretation, based in LA. Both of them use a deadpan, purportedly factual photography to identify themselves as experimental geographers. This is one of Center for Land Use Interpretation's pieces. Talk about it. I'm sure every one of you know about the Center for Land Use Interpretation, or CLUI, and the way they're disingenuously and even humorously dedicated to, quote, the increase and diffusion of information about how the world's lands are appropriated, utilized, and perceived. Sounds very calm. They're my favorite example of a new conceptual art, or not art, that reimagines landscape and place within a broader and more social and analytical framework. The sly and apparently apolitical blandness with which their work is presented belies the hard information that it offers about militarism, corporate destruction, roads barging through wilderness, deleted communities, their phrase, and so on. CLUI dissects all kinds of unexpected sites through their land use database, a peripatetic land use museum, a site extrapolation division that conducts real and virtual tours of unusual and exemplary land use sites. For example, Dauphin Island in the Gulf of Mexico, whose stubborn residents rebuild higher and higher on stilts in the face of increasingly powerful storms. CLUI trumps cynicism, as a friend of mine put it, working on a fine line between art and everything else, specializing in the not particularly special, seeing the contemporary landscape itself as a museum. Like art, but unlike most art, the center's ground-up strategies examine information hidden in plain sight, places whose whole avenues of experience lie unexplored because nobody has ever wandered down those roads with the attentiveness they deserve. Their staff also warns that too much information can be as obfuscating as too little, so it really is art in that sense. This is by Terry Evans. It's a bombing range in the Midwest. I have no idea why it's a Star of David. As an ally of Palestinians fighting to regain their land, I could find a metaphor here, but I won't go into that. The late writer Alexander Wilson could have been referring to Kluwe when he said, "We tour the disparate surfaces of everyday life as a way of reintegrating a fragmented world." And such sites are those described by Peter Goen as human nature, all one word, or altered landscapes, the title of a show and collection at the Nevada Museum of Art. Of course, almost every landscape we know has been altered one way or another, usually by humankind over the ages. The term is understood to mean that the landscape has changed relatively recently and not necessarily for the better. For some, any change is bad change. Landscapes are spoiled as soon as they're altered by forces beyond our control. Hubris leads us to believe that we should decide what changes and how, as though agreement were possible in this polyphonic world. Some, for instance, would agree to the destruction of a lesser creature's habitat to build a playground. Prairie dogs would be those creatures where I live. Others would comprehend the long-term environmental connections between a little rodent and the children who would play there. As we discover the social and ecological subtleties of alteration, we begin to understand the nuances and interconnections between what we call nature and what we call human, which is, of course, merely another branch of nature, though we've done everything we can to separate ourselves from those parts we think we can dominate. This is by John Gannis, a recent photograph of the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico. It's the National Seashore Preserve in Pensacola Beach, Florida, in 2010. Photographers catch moments in this process, give us reference points, something to hang on to, make us aware that history is continuous, moving over borders from yesterday through today to tomorrow. The more striking the image, the more we're likely to remember it. But some of the most meaningful are subtler and take longer to absorb. And memory is crucial to the social study of land and its uses. Although we've long passed the moment when photographs were seen as truth, they still participate in the presentation of multiple truths, which could also be a definition of collective memory, which in turn calls for a diversity of individual viewers. Photography might be described as the thing that fills the hole between us and other things or people. It often offers up an imaginary history that has its roots in the real, but we can never tell what's real and what isn't, especially if the image is maliciously or ignorantly miscaptioned, as often happens in photojournalism. Artists confronted with a specific landscape are conventionally invited to impose their visions upon it, an overlay of personal or conceptual preference. This is by Canadian Sylvie Redman, who did exactly that in her Petite Histoire des Ombres series, superimposing her vision on 19th century paintings, simultaneously picturing history and dispelling specificity, a kind of obfuscating rephotography. The little history of shadows is what the title means. But most existing places demand to be considered for themselves, not as a blank slate, but as an already evolved image with a history that can be altered and even transformed, but never entirely erased. These are both pictures from Sharon Stewart's El Cerrito series about acequias in New Mexico. You have a few in southern Colorado, the ditches that irrigate small farmlands. And they clean them. There's a La Limpia each year. In the spring, you clean the ditches, and the whole community does it. And she documented this at this little tiny town of El Cerrito. Collaboration is, I see it as the sort of social extension of collage, another product of modernity's fragmentation. Good documentary photography is a collaboration with the events or places, and sometimes the residents it records, though photographing, respecting, or exploiting people is usually a lot more problematic than shooting landscape. Sometimes collaboration is possible with those people who are of the place for generations, as in this series. In other cases, collaboration with ecologists who know a place close up in excruciating detail makes the whole landscape photography enterprise far more complex and more layered. For instance, the migrants and border control agents for whom a place is a matter of life and death, as documented by David Taylor in his new book, which this is from Working the Line, which, among other things, shows us the strange presences of the Mexican border monuments, these lonely sentinels in contested landscape, or graffitied accomplices to the misbegotten border wall. That's another one from that series. Obviously, context is crucial. An uprooted photograph can be floated in any direction. Landscape photography is often so generalized that without the aid of captions, we'd have no idea what part of the world we were seeing, where it is, how it got that way. I find it tremendously frustrating to look at an image that's untitled, uncaptioned, and displaced, one that's been deprived of its specificity by aesthetic intentions because its maker has decided that specificity injures its status as art. Uprooted is the essence of this image, the colonial remains of the German manager's house in Luderitz, Namibia, Africa, by Andrea Robbins and Max Bescher, who specialize in what they call transportation of place or places. This is transportation of place, places, people, and costumes that are simultaneously specific and seriously out of context. They explore these places where people's illusions have replaced their realities, like Holland, Michigan, where windmills and tulips and so forth suddenly become a Dutch place. Here, both history and memory are skewed but not inaccurate. No, that was not supposed to. Anyway. Provocative in another way are mysterious images of places where something happened, in which the ambiguity is swept away only by the captions, which provide a context the images can't offer on their own. This is by Carol Gallagher, who lives in Colorado now and is sitting here tonight. It's Amargosa Valley, 10 miles downwind from the Nevada test site, from her book American Ground Zero, which is the most moving photography book and first-person testimony book on the Nevada test site downwinders. They're beautiful pictures of devastated landscapes that have been criticized for aestheticizing disaster. But when the places are unidentified, their images fail to articulate the social importance of landscape and land use. This is by Drex Brooks, part of his Sweet Medicine series, which again look like sort of ordinary places, but they're all sites of massacres of Native American peoples. And this one is the Camp Grant massacre site. While I find very appealing J.B. Jackson's description of American history, reflected in land use as a dramatic discontinuity, instead of the smooth timeline we get in textbooks, I'm also intrigued by what Gertrude Stein called the continuous present, time as space flowing across terrain unmarked by boundaries, so that people don't feel separated from but are integrated into place. Los Angeles artist Amanda Ross Ho said in a recent interview, "We live and act in the present, and yet it is the hardest moment to describe. The present is our ongoing, ever-changing moment of origin, a collage of everything, a multifaceted jewel made up of memory, feeling, thinking, and whatever you're looking at." End of the quote. Similarly, I'd like to think of a photograph as a field rather than an artifact, suggesting sequences, layers, and periphery, even when the number of images is limited. This is by Shubhankar Banerjee. It's Arctic caribou. This is a huge photograph. So you have to, well, I guess the screen is about as bigger than the picture. His photographs of the Arctic and of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge played a real major part in saving it, which it's been saved once again recently, partially, from oil and gas drilling, for the time being anyway. Photography is, in a way, the original ready-made. It exists in the moment it was taken and in the moment it's perused. As John Tumler has written, the photographic process is subtractive. It's literally a cut in the space-time continuum. It's a minute, fragmentary part of an infinitely greater whole, the world that is shaved off at its edges. Photographers talk a lot about edges. So every single image we see, no matter how trivial or unaesthetic, is a clue to the whole span of time between when it was taken and when we're looking at it. The best images present not just what we see, they're also haunted by invisible layers and spaces the photographer has managed to imply. This is another one of Shubhankar Banerjee's pictures, and this is the Gwich'in, who live in the Arctic National Refuge, butchering caribou sustainably. Places and photographs of places are the bearers of history, personal, regional, and global change. This need not mean a focus on the past. History is constantly being created and recreated, and recent history may mean more to residents than ancient history. This is by Peter Goen. It's a destroyed road, as he says here, and crater, at the Nevada test site as well. Landscape is almost by definition context, time and space, and rephotography of a place years ago and in the present raises some interesting questions on that level. Rephotography can be the vehicle for reimagining not only a place but the time that defines the invisible interim between the original and the retake. And in the interest of full disclosure, I'm working with Peter Goen on a rephotography project now called Time and Time Again, which is concerned with the way archaeological sites are interpreted and preserved and what the cultural ownership is and so forth. This is two of his, of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. Rephotographers can stand in a landscape and find the same hill still there in the background, even though it may now be hidden by trees or buildings. But the where can be easier to fathom than the when. It takes a lot more research or imagination to figure out how much time has elapsed between images and how to express that interim in the images. The answer to Kevin Lynch's classic question, what time is this place, would have to be both then and now. This is by both of them by Juliet Sinajani, who is a Diné or Navajo photographer, and Creek and Seminole as well. And they pretty well speak for themselves. The curators of a provocative exhibition called the Potosi Principle, recently at the Reina Sofia in Madrid, tried to counter the linear evolutionist narrative of enlightened modernity by connecting past and present as a temporal loop in a Baroque game of mirrors. But they also noted that the institution of art can easily act in complicity with a new global slavery, the commercialization of subjective viewpoints, end of quote. And this raises the ethical balancing act that all of the arts, including photography, has to perform today. Once photography was divested of its truth status, it was opened up to that ambiguity that many consider to be the heart of meaningful art, even though it all too often devolves into a self-indulgent incomprehensibility. Contemporary photography, by definition, is aligned with both reality and creativity, the two forever sparring. And this is a piece by Amy Stein, and I took this as an incredible accident that she managed to catch this coyote in a parking lot. And then it turned out the coyote is stuffed. And then somebody told me that they weren't sure it was stuffed, that she was very ambiguous about it, so I don't know what's going on here. Walker Evans once said, art is never a document, but it can adopt that style. It's tricky to endow documents with too much aesthetic interest, quirky angles, odd subject matter, subtle color. Sometimes I want to challenge photographers to give up your relatively recent status as high artists and return to photography's freer, more open, more functionalist and populist legacy. What good did it do to be taken into the art world in the last 30 or 40 years? Certainly it's a no less commercial venue than what is called commercial photography. As a recent piece by the Bruce High Quality Foundation notes, what happens in the art world stays in the art world. I should think that photographers who enjoy far more and farther ranging possibilities than the makers of painting, sculpture, video, or installation do would feel claustrophobic when welcomed into and then confined in the art world. We can talk about that in the discussion period. This is by John Willis. It's Dogs at the Pine Ridge Reservation at the Wounded Knee Monument. So this may be just a personal hobby horse. I've spent most of my life advocating for art that escapes the art world and elopes with life. I'm still looking for art forms that are buried in social energies not yet recognized as art. It's another 60s thing. Given the public indifference to art and the stigma of corporate and boutique classes' attraction to art for status or whatever, this might be better accomplished by more slippery undercover means to justify that end, like the many young collectives that are springing up all over the world to act in areas like urban planning and agriculture and mining and so forth. Art, with a capitalist A, as somebody said, has exponentially expanded over the last 20 years, paralleling the national obesity epidemic. I found myself telling a young artist, it's a powerful image, but it should probably be bigger, in part to illuminate through enlargement, and in part merely to attract attention in a highly competitive art world arena. This is by Chris Jordan, and I think there's a show of his in Boulder right now at the Natural History Museum, or it's just about to open. I may have disappointed some of you by not getting into the issues of artificial and virtual sites. the ways that cyberspace provides instant historical memory, mixing past and present in unexpected ways, while at the same time promoting cultural amnesia. I tried, but I soon realized that I'm hardly equipped to deal with it. I just got on the internet and email over a year ago. I can barely wrap my head around all the directions suggested by a single link, and I'm still wrestling with the dislike of artists' websites. Sorry. I'm at least aware that we're immersed in a virtual tsunami of cultural knowledge almost every minute of our waking lives, and a lot of it is increasingly visual. The dictionary definition of virtual includes achieving the feeling of reality, and this is Chris Jordan's. It's called Denali, and then it's made up of. Sorry, I forgot to bring the figures, but it's say 1 million images of Denali, which is the SUV, and that was the number sold in 1 week in the U.S. or something. I mean, all of his pieces. It's a series called Running the Numbers, where you see something, and then when you boil it down, you get all these tiny. It's the exact number of the toilet paper we use in a week or a day or something like that, and the trees that come from it, got done in for it. So tourism, for instance, could be called a virtual experience because it's so often mediated by illusion, and it takes real work to make it real. That goes for photography, too. Someone said that computer screens mediate between the real and the virtual. That's also one of photography's roles. David Levi Strauss, in his latest book, quotes painter Leon Golub, saying that he used photographs as sources because he was trying to make some connection to what is going on in the world, to make some kind of contact. So he used the instruments that our modern world offers: photography, film, computers. But I'm not sure what all this means for landscape, where context is so important. What effect have Google Earth and the GPS had on new landscape photography? There must be works out there I don't know about that are confronting these enormous changes in the way we see, changes that make the distancing of objective documentary photography seem downright touchy-feely. As cultural workers, how do we respond? What is literally to be made of these changes? Are they only good for marketing? Do they make art irrelevant? There have been several periods in my life when I thought art had a chance to reach what we earnestly called a broader audience. Well, now we've got it. And it seems possible that what we call art could drown in it. I'll end by discussing in a little more detail a California project that raises some of these issues. The Legacy Project focuses on the ongoing documentation of the remains of a former Marine Corps air station at El Toro, California. The 6 collaborating photographers, Jerry Birchfield, Mark Chamberlain, Jacques Garnier, Robert Johnson, Doug Mccullough, and Clayton Spada, all guys, have produced 90,000 photographs, last I heard, and counting. Some are intended as straight documentation of the 20-mile periphery. I shouldn't have gotten into that. I forgot this one. This is by the Anything Company in Canada in the 60s, early 70s, and it's about how some places are supposedly not art-worthy. So this is suburbia in Vancouver, and suburbia is, don't bother to look at this because it's not worth it. And now we'll get to El Toro. This is El Toro. Anyway, they've some intended as straight documentation. There's a 20-mile perimeter of the 4,700 acre base, and others are individual artist views of the places and its artifacts. The Legacy Project would fit into Kluwe's database, although perhaps ignoring Kluwe's warnings about overkill. It provides so much context, in fact, that it remythologizes the place with multiple, if not infinite, captions. What do I do to get this thing moving? With each bit of information, another layer of this photographic sea becomes perceptible, recalling the obsessively detailed map described in a story by Jorge Luis Borges, a map so intricate that it eventually covers the entire territory it maps. At the center of this amazing amount of activity is the great picture, which you see here. One of those crazy ideas that occur to artists, an immense black and gray, somewhat blurry image, 25 by 100 feet, evidence first and foremost of risks taken and overcome. It's the offspring of a camera obscura or pinhole process. Its womb was a jet hangar. The apocalyptic fields of dark sky and light foreground are an evocative inversion, betraying the picture's origins as an upside-down photographic negative. There's a 19th century aura to its ghostly emanations, though it has little in common with the monumental clarity of the classic U.S. photographic survey pictures. The documentary perimeter photographs are tellingly taken from outside the airbase. The inside, still out of bounds to the public, is where the great picture lurks, becoming a backdrop for unrevealed drama. Its vagueness works both for and against it. In one sense, it's wholly dependent on its birthplace. High-tech towers loom over the flat land like a prison or a fantastic castle. It is, or rather it pictures, a moment in time not quite gone, but the process of disappearing into the distance, providing a backdrop for future narratives, but in the process. The great picture conceals, maybe I should go back to the great picture, conceals or contains many histories, from indigenous occupation to Spanish and Mexican ranching to Anglo farming to a World War II military base to the great park it's now becoming, offering a quick lesson in Western settlement and capital investment. Deracinated, transplanted to other venues, it'll become generalized, something else. As photo theorist John Tagg has written, the production of a new and specific reality requires not an alchemy but a history, outside of which the existential essence of photography is empty. It's to the reality not of the past but of present meanings and of changing discursive systems that we must turn. The great picture clearly became a kind of group obsession, perhaps even more so since one of its originators, Jerry Birchfield, died prematurely while it was underway. The project now commemorates not only a place but an artist. Like many of the photographs I've been showing, the Legacy Project as a whole can ultimately be seen as a meditation on obsolescence, the fate of land constructed for defense, rejected by power and capital, and then saved by the magic wand of civic improvement to become a site of leisure and enjoyment. Most of us live our lives in similarly layered landscapes, totally ignorant of the histories buried beneath our daily activities. Among the individual artists' projects, only Doug Mccullough, by juxtaposing text from transhistoric combat zones with poignantly insignificant found objects in his explorations of El Toro, deals with the fact that this place was all about politics and power, about war. El Toro was the threshold as troops moved through between their personal lives and military life, or between life and death. We've often been warned that political power belongs to those who control memory, that history is written by the victors and so forth. Given the assumption that even documents are never purely objective, there's a danger that such a blanket of imagery as the perimeter section of the Legacy Project provides, could obscure the heart of the matter. By becoming that heart, perhaps the great picture is an antidote to this contradiction, countering with a kind of mirage the crisp declarative statements expected of documents. This is another one by Carol Gallagher. This is my scribbled notes from American Ground Zero. It's Marjorie Black downwind at her ranch south of Sheeprock Mountain. It's an absolutely beautiful landscape, and again, it's about other things. The Legacy Project, in these terms, is responsible for constructing the social memory of this enigmatic place and others like it, most of which will never be documented to this extent. El Toro stands in for our multiple national sacrifice sites, including the Nevada test site, Los Alamos, and the test site, which has already poisoned 1.6 trillion gallons of water, and the Rocky Mountain Arsenal here in Denver, now an unlikely wildlife refuge. That's a photograph by Dory Klein. And now we have to ask if these lethal places are being normalized by photography. This is by Meredith Rubenstein, Broken Landscape, from a series about Los Alamos. So any single photographic strategy is hard put to outline the deeper causes and repercussions in such a shifting landscape. Now, even more than ever, images contain lessons in local and global power relations. I like to think in terms of ripple effects, content that begins from a center, a very specific place, in what William Least Heat Moon calls a deep map, just what Joe Deal was talking about. And then with really consciously lived experience, it moves out from there in ripples to deal with land use, land rights, the politics of property, the relics of colonialism, climate change, or ongoing national expansionism. A great way of learning where we are is to think in terms of these ripples and how they affect our center, and where other rings intercede to affect us and the environment and so forth. If artists, and especially photographers, frame what we see and how we see, the ultimate frame we need to address is the limitations imposed by society itself that we need to address. I'm sorry, I'll start that all over again. The ultimate frame we need to address is the limitations imposed by society itself and by exhausted notions of art and its functions. There are cracks in the walls, though. This is by Robert Dawson. I think this was supposed to come in earlier. PowerPoint has got me completely confused. This is a pipe that all the water for San Francisco goes through. There are cracks in the walls, though. I like Tim Collins' alternative. He says, consider the term interface as an analogy for art, a common boundary, the interconnection between systems, concepts, environments, and people. And this is a nice explosive ending. It's the volcano at Stromboli by Joan Myers. Thanks, and I'd love to have some discussion. And I'm patient about waiting for the first question, which always takes a while for people to come up with. It doesn't have to be a question. If it's discussion, just keep it fairly short.
I have one. Towards the beginning, you mentioned that you didn't, like when photographs didn't have a caption added to them. Mm-hmm. Do you think that only applies to photography, or do you think that should apply to paintings and sculpture and other forms of art?
That's a good question. We let paintings get away with more, I think. They are supposed. In fact, it's funny. Today I was at the Denver Art Museum, and there's a painting by a man who lives in the same village I live in, Woody Gwynn, who unfortunately is very ill at the moment. But there's a lovely, big, long horizontal painting in the Western collection there. And I know exactly where that is. It's practically my view. But he doesn't say where it is. And I thought, why? I mean, he calls it Muddy Gap or something like that. It's not the name of it. It obfuscates the fact this is a real place in a real state, in a real area, which happens to be the Galisteo Basin, which I write about a lot. But so I think it really, I mean, it doesn't take away from anything to say what it is. I mean, I've never quite understood that. It's an art thing. I mean, it's like, if you have to say where it is, it's probably not good art. I mean, I don't know where that comes from, but it's kind of dumb. So I definitely think painters should think of it too. Often painters aren't talking about a specific place. I mean, they're making up things. And then you can, that could be called untitled, I guess, perfectly legitimately.
But do you think if it has a caption, it takes away from the viewer's interpretation of it?
No, I really don't. I mean, how are you interpreting a mountain? I mean, interpreting a mountain. If it's not going to hurt you to know that mountain is in such and such an area. You can still think of it as a mountain. I mean, it can be both that mountain and any mountain perfectly easily, unless the person is terribly literal about what they're thinking about, the viewer. Thank you. Yeah.
I think the lack of specificity is a uniquely 20th century phenomenon?
No, not really. He said it was the lack of specificity, a completely 20th century phenomenon. No, actually, what I was looking at the art museum this morning was the Western history stuff that they have there, and a lot of times there they don't say what tribe it is; they just say Indians, which is very annoying, especially to Native Americans. And again, there's no reason why these things have to be sort of mythologized and taken off into some vague place. I don't get that. I mean, if the artist feels terribly strongly about it, obviously it's the artist's choice. But I just wish that art schools didn't teach that you shouldn't title things, and I think that's what happens. Yeah.
When you had mentioned that you feel that photography should come back to a sense of self and have more freedom and be taken away from what you said, quote, high art, could you then argue, though, that in its infancy, photography was always confined to one thing or another, especially when you take into consideration that it wasn't considered art in its beginning, that it took several several decades really before the community in any respect began to accept it as anything other than documentation.
Oh, really 100 years. I mean, it was virtually a century at least before it, so do I, yeah, I mean, I still feel it, I mean, maybe it had to pass through art to get the acclaim that it gets now. And of course, a lot of photography now is completely embroiled in the art world. I mean, video and what have you. So in a funny way, that was more a provocative statement than anything else, because I mean, photographers can't en masse get up and walk out of the art world. I mean, it's not going to happen. But I just wish that, young photographers, people starting to think that this is where they're headed, could realize that there may be other ways to work with photography. I mean, in communities or wherever. But it's true, you wouldn't be able to sell your work for thousands and thousands of dollars. So, and that's always tempting to anybody. But it just is, the art world is a confinement, what Smithson again called cultural confinement. And even though it looks now, I mean, it may look to you all who are students now that it's broken out of that and art is everywhere and it can do anything, and it's really not quite true. And the populist aspect of photography is very nice because people really do understand what photography is about. I mean, they look at it as truth still. Now you can do all this theoretical stuff about how nothing is true, and obviously the photographer's eye is the thing that's making that image the way it is, and another photographer could take a totally different truth and so forth and so on. That's all fun to think about. I don't know. I mean, I just like to throw that out and see. It's funny. I've said that in a couple of lectures, and I think you're the first person who's ever jumped on it. Usually people, and one time it was all photographers, and everybody just like passed over it. so thank you for bringing it up, even though I don't have an answer of any kind. But I just wish it were in the pot to be thought about and so on as a choice. And of course you can do both. I mean, Martha Rossler, who has used a lot of photography, mostly photography in her work, photography and text, has always talked about, what did she use the word, decoys or something, but anyway, the main thing is you look at the context in which you're going to show it, and then you can make choices like different titles or whatever, back to this caption business. I always use the example of a friend of mine, Howardina Pindell, who's an African-American artist in New York, with this big, beautiful painting that was pretty well looked like an abstraction, or you didn't know what it was about. And when it was shown in an art museum, she showed it with Untitled or some very vague title. Then she showed it in the Studio Museum in Harlem, and she put a very specific title on it. And she said, "This is what this is about." It was about slavery or whatever. And that really interested me because she was saying, okay, I want this audience to know what it's about. And I don't care whether this audience does know, or maybe she thought that this audience over the art museum audience wouldn't take it seriously if it had a specific title, a political title. So all of that kind of comes into consideration. I mean, you can make a piece, show it in a museum or a gallery, and be less specific and be more ambiguous and more ironic and so forth. But if you're showing that same piece in a neighborhood museum, a community center or something, you might want to be much more specific about it. So it's again, the artist's choice. But it's just an interesting subject to me. Anybody? Nope, yeah.
Have you had the opportunity to go to Louisiana in the Ninth Ward to see the instruction there?
Have I been to New Orleans? No, I haven't. I was partly raised there, but I haven't been back for many, many years. A friend of mine, Rebecca Solnit, has written a wonderful book called A Paradise from Paradise. God, now I can't think of the title. Paradise from Hell, Made in Hell. Yeah. Anyway, which is an interesting take on the New Orleans situation. But I haven't been there.
It's just that you seem to be a collector of frontiers, and it's a new one. And I think there's some possibilities to see beyond the destruction and to see it as a new place.
Yeah, and I don't know if you couldn't hear him, he's talking about their possibilities for looking at New Orleans after Katrina as a new place. And there have been several photo books out about it that I have seen. And there's both hope and a lot of lack of hope, or a very realistic lack of hope in New Orleans. It's I don't know, don't get me off on politics, I'm so discouraged at the moment, I don't know. Anyway, especially since New Mexico just got a new, our first Latina woman governor in the country, which sounds good on some levels, but unfortunately she's a wild-ass right-winger and wants to wants to get rid of everything environmental that isn't good for business. If it isn't good for business, she doesn't want to hear about it, period, which is really frightening because we've worked very hard for some environmental issues there, and they're all going to bite the dust, looks like, unless we can stop her, so who knows. Oh, there's somebody else who's, yeah.
I was wondering about the environmental issues in relation to these photographs, because of course there's moments in the history of landscape photography that kind of intersect with various environmental philosophies. And I'm just wondering about the relationship of, say, Kluwe or some of the other, photographic collectives. Do you see them as intersecting with contemporary environmental politics in any way? I know it's a diverse.
Well, yeah, I mean, I won't talk about the diversity, but I can talk. She was asking if I saw Kluwe, the Center for Land Use Interpretation, as intersecting with current environmental issues. They've been very sly about that because they don't want to be seen as political. So what they do is simply present this stuff totally, like I said, deadpan. But they look in places that nobody looks. I always say that they're the people who show you what's behind that those wire fences that you see going by, and you have no idea what's behind those, and they have a little sign saying "keep out." That's all you know. And they take tours to those places. I mean, even Nellis Air Force Base, to the hidden UFO so-called site and so forth. But I think they're this business of trumping cynicism, which a friend of mine said. I love that about them. They do. It's a political stance as far as I'm concerned. But if you tell Matthew Coolidge, who runs it and is it in a sense, although there are lots of people working with him, he'll just sort of smile quietly and he won't say anything about politics, because that's really what they're based on. But I do think they intersect with the environmental issues very much so, because they do show what's going on. They also show things like mom and pop caves and the Dauphin Island stuff, but the Dauphin Island is another. I mean, that's sort of a commentary on the Mississippi River floods, where people just insist on going back and, they have insurance, so they go back and build their houses right in the same place, and the river's going to flood again. I mean, this is what rivers do. And that kind of I don't want to call it stupidity, but maybe stubbornness or whatever that is an environmental issue. Is people keeping on doing this kind of thing, and the Dauphin Island series is sort of about that. The stilts get higher and higher. I mean, whatever. Yeah.
So you talked about how not to be confined by the art world, and I like the phrase you use when an artist elopes with life. Can you talk about that a little bit? And I don't know if you could conjure up, talk about some artists.
Yeah, I'm always terrible at thinking of examples when I get up in front of people like this, because I always think I'm going to leave hundreds of people out and so forth. But I think when you start out with a community or a sort of political idea, and instead of starting out with an art idea, it makes a difference in your work. I mean, you can become very well known anyway. And I say I won't do examples because I never come up with the right ones. But it depends on sort of where your head is at. I mean, if you want to deal with environmental things first and foremost, you might go in as somebody who cares about environmental issues, and then as an artist, you begin to sort of see things and think things, and images or strategies or something start coming up in your mind, which is why art is so important. And we were talking about that today, about how consciousness raising is really one of the major functions of art. People don't like to think art has any function, God forbid, because that just makes it too close to the world and so forth, and you can tell how much I object to all of that. But there are a lot of ways. I mean, I don't know. Hans Hacke, who shows in museums, actually he doesn't get asked to show in many museums because of his politics, but he comments on corporations and he names names. Leon Golub was somebody whose art was just painting and wasn't like leaping up and going out in the streets or anything, but he could say things about what was going on because he wasn't afraid. There's always been a thing in the art world against naming names, and that may apply to Kluwe as well. I mean, but they do say where they are, and they're very specific about place. and so forth. But I could write. This is why I read my lectures, because I'm a writer and not a talker. My mind goes blank when I'm up here in front. But there are a lot of things going on all around the world now. I mean, Wolkenklausur or something like that in Germany, where they work with housing, and they're artists, people who are artists in real life everywhere, and I love that. I mean, I think and sometimes they are kind of validated by museum contexts and gallery contexts, and they sort of rise to the top of the pile, and sometimes they don't, but they're doing infinitely valuable work, from my opinion. Yeah.
In your, you were mentioned in the book Who Cares?
Excuse me?
The book Who Cares, you were a part of that, where you would sit down at the table at dinner and...
Oh, yeah, right. That was a creative time thing, yeah.
How would you say that has affected the way that you see...
The way what?
The way that you see like photography and art as a whole, not just public art.
That symposium thing?
Yeah.
Not much, I don't think. I mean, frankly, we were all where we were already. I mean, I don't think that talking to each other, we enjoy talking to each other, but we were there because we were all into that, rather than to be transformed by it. I think what I was transformed by, if anything, was both feminism and the anti-war movement in the Vietnam War period. Those were where we really did take art out on the streets to some extent. I'm giving a talk in Boulder in a couple of days about the nuclear landscape, and I have a few slides from June 12th, 1982, which a lot of you are too young to remember, but when 1 million people marched in front of the UN to demand the end of nuclear weapons. It didn't work, but it certainly made an impression at the time, and people just made all kinds of wonderful stuff. I mean, I think when artists get thrown into other places, they really learn a lot, even if they go back and stay in museums for the rest of their lives. I've always been a great advocate of taking students out and saying, okay, here you are in such and such a community, find out what their issues are, or here you are on the streets and you've got something you care about, or whatever. Just getting out of the art the central art context often changes people drastically, even if, as I say, they don't want to do that for the rest of their life. It's really a kind of transformative experience. Oh, yeah, sorry.
I'd just love to hear you talk on photography as both art and journalism. So photojournalism, and whether you see it having the power to really transform for social and environmental transformation.
Photography and as journalism, as photojournalism. I think it's tremendous. I mean, I don't think that a picture is worth 1,000 words. I think pictures and words together are wonderful things. And with just a few words, like those Peter Goen just happened to have words, and Wanda Hammerbeck. I mean, Wanda Hammerbeck takes very beautiful landscape photographs and then just puts these sort of pale, not very obtrusive captions underneath them. And in her case, you don't know where the place is exactly, but it sends a message from that to the landscape. So you could call that journalism. I mean, Shubhankar Banerjee, I think, is often considered a journalistic photographer in a way, because he does take on issues and they affect people. I mean, somebody mentioned the long history of environmental photography and environmental issues, and that now I can't even remember who the photographers were, but in the late 19th century, when they were deciding they'd have national parks, the photographic surveys were incredibly important, because people had never been out, especially to the West, and saw these places and thought, oh my God, that probably should be preserved, that's really gorgeous. And Shubhankar was doing a similar thing with the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So I think journalism is a great place for photographers. I mean, but then I know Susan Meiselas, who I've written about and is a friend, she talks about she's a Magnum photographer, and she talks about when I said the misplaced or abusive caption or something, when other people caption your work, you're often in for it. Because once you're a journalist, a photojournalist, you're handed over to an editor. They'll pay you for your pictures, but you don't have the final say on what they're going to do with those pictures. And she had a couple of, when she was working in Central America and Nicaragua, it was a picture of people on a food line, and wherever it was published, Time or someplace said that this was because the Sandinistas were such terrible people, nobody had food, and in fact it was after a flood or something. I mean, it was a totally different reason that these people were lined up for food. So that's something else to watch out for. So is that it? Good, thanks.